Hey there. Let's create a transaction component that can be used to cleanly display a transaction object from the backend. So right now we're stringifying the entire transaction data, but it's overflowing across the window and it's not easily digestible. So let's create a new transaction.js file in the components directory to house this new transaction component. The file is going to be transaction.js capitalized. First up, we're going to import React from the React module as usual, but then this time we're not going to import the component class. We're going to use an alternative syntax to create the component this time. And the syntax we're going to use is called the stateless functional style of creating a component. So first up, a component in this syntax has to be stateless. So the syntax only works if the component you need doesn't need to modify any state throughout the life of its component. And second, the syntax is functional. So we're going to create the component, a constant of transaction that is equal to a JavaScript function. So let's have our arrow function syntax, and notice that the class name is capitalized as usual. Okay, there's two key parts of the transaction that we want to display. First, there's the input part and the output map part of the transaction. Now, the question is, where is this transaction data going to come from? Well, the blocks component takes care of fetching all the blocks from the backend. It then passes a block property to every single block component. Now, the block component has a job of displaying the transaction data. Now, this data field can be used as a new transaction property for the transaction component. So normally when it comes to a normal React component, we can get something from props such as this.props.transaction, as long as the parent component passes down that data. However, in this case, where is props going to come from in the stateless functional component style? And the answer is that in the stateless functional component style, props is the main parameter to the overall function, which means we can get the input and the output map from props.transaction. All right, cool. But we can do even one better. We can destructure the props using JavaScript syntax right from the parameter. So we can say that the props incoming object is going to consist of an object that has a transaction field. Therefore, we can get rid of this props reference at all and still get the transaction data. All right, now we can render some JSX. So let's return, as usual, some JSX tags. In this div, let's display the input. So let's have a div field. And the relevant part of the input that we want the user to see is the input address. And let's style this as if it was an email template, for example. We're going to have a from label. And we're going to say that this is from the input.address. Now the input address is a public key, which is rather long. So let's do a substring of it from 0 to 20. But we want to inform the user that this isn't the entire string. So let's place this within a template string. So we're going to surround this with backticks and then a pair of curly braces as well. And then we're going to have a ... So that way this signals the fact that this is not the entire address, but a substring of it. Now another piece that we want to show in this top field is the balance of the input. And to find that balance, we get the input.amount. So overall, the from address is going to have the actual address itself, as well as the balance. Now the output map should be displayed as well. This consists of multiple recipients and amounts. Now it would be ideal to have an array of all of these recipients, so that way we can render JSX for each one. Therefore, at the top of the method, let's make a recipients array that is the result of calling object.keys on the output map. So the output map, every key is a different recipient, and the value for that is an amount value to send to that recipient as part of the transaction. Now we can use our usual strategy of mapping over an array to return JSX. So we have a similar case where we're mapping over the blocks within the blocks component to return a block component for every single block field and data within the overall blocks array. In this case, we're looking one recipient at a time through a callback function. And in here, let's return a div overall. Since we're mapping over data, we need to provide a key property so that way React can tell the difference between every recipient. The recipient string should be unique, so therefore we can use the recipient as a string itself. To match our email style formatting, let's have a to field, so a to label, and we're going to have the same strategy of taking a substring of the overall recipient value because it's also a public key, which will be rather long. So let's have a substring from 0 to 20, and then we're going to have the usual ... as well. All right. I then just like to match the balance field, we're going to have a sent field over here, which specifies how much the recipient received within the output map. And we can access that value with output map recipient. All right, cool. Now notice that all we're doing within this map function is returning JSX right away for each recipient. We can shorten this syntax overall by having the return value in the body be surrounded by parentheses. So that way we are shortcutting a little bit the fact that we're returning inline a piece of JSX right away. Cool. We can even indent this one less, which makes the overall syntax a lot shorter. So make sure these are parentheses as the return value overall, which makes it an inline return of the callback function. All right, so that takes care of the transaction component. Now we need to share this with other files. So by default, we're going to export this transaction component. All right, once you have all of these changes, head back to the block.js file, and we're going to use the transaction component. Within block.js at the top, let's import transaction from the local transaction file. Cool. And now instead of our default json.stringify data display in the full-on display, now we can return a full-on transaction component for every single transaction that is within this data field. So we're going to map over all of the data, and this gives us a callback that we can work with each transaction one at a time. And the return value of this, again, we're going to use parentheses to return right away. Let's have a div overall, and the key to this is going to be the transaction.id. So recall that every single transaction object has an ID field, which is unique to every single transaction. And within this div, we can provide the transaction component JSX. It'll be a self-enclosing tag. It doesn't have any children. And the crucial part is having a transaction property. So that way the transaction object data is passed down as props to the transaction component. Cool. Finally, to provide some separation between every single transaction, let's also have this header ruler element, which will create a horizontal line in the UI so that way the transactions are distinguished. All right, go ahead and save that. And with that saved, head back to the browser, go to localhost 3000, and on a refresh to do the fetches one more time, well, there we have our blocks data. And showing more, wow, this transaction is a lot more neat. We see that there's the hash of the transaction as well as its timestamp. But now the cool part is that there's this from field, which notifies who made the transaction in every single piece of the data for the block and who we're sending the transaction to. Cool. So clicking show more on the other ones, the from addresses are different every time. The recipients are different. So overall, it's a very nice piece of UI. And if you scroll down to the bottom and you look at the last block, you're going to find that the balances have been significantly affected overall throughout the various transactions that have occurred in this blockchain history. Okay, it's looking pretty good. But one thing to nitpick is that the styling is just a bit off. Everything is a bit squished at the moment. But this can be fixed by applying a 5% padding to the overall transaction component. So let's add a transaction class name within the transaction.js file to the overall div. So the class name is transaction. And now in the index.css file, we can apply a 5% padding to the transaction class. So .transaction, the padding should be 5%. All right, cool. And with that saved, again, we're going to refresh to get all the data. And then opening this, yep, now there's a lot more space and this overall transaction data looks a lot cleaner when it comes to the overall block. Cool. So now that we have our transaction data nicely displayed and toggling, next let's improve this front end overall by giving the user a way to conduct transactions from the front end through a form. Also, we'll give them the ability to check out the data in the transaction pool. Now, this main app component is already getting pretty crowded. So if we added the form to this, well, it'd be really overblown. The main page would just have so much information. So before we move on to these new features, let's also add in the React Router module. This is going to allow us to create pages within the application that can display different UI based on URLs. Overall, this will free us from having to add a bunch of new UI in the already crowded app component. Cool, so let's move on to adding different pages in the app to hold various functionality with React Router next.